You should have never been born, my dad told me while handing my brother the CEO role. I just smiled and said, this is justice because of your secrets. Weeks later, I pulled the plug and watched everything fall apart. I, 28M, stood in my father's mahogany-paneled office, watching him hand over the golden nameplate that read CEO to my younger brother. The weight of his words still echoed in my mind. You should have never been born, delivered with the same casual cruelty he'd perfected over the years. But this time, I didn't flinch. Instead, I smiled and told him this was justice because of his secrets. He looked confused, maybe even concerned, but brushed it off like he always did. What my father didn't know was that I'd spent the last 3 years quietly documenting every illegal transaction, every bribe, every tax evasion scheme that kept our family's construction empire afloat. While he groomed my brother to take over, treating me like an unwanted burden, I'd been building my own kind of inheritance, one that would destroy everything he'd built. The company had been in our family for 40 years. My grandfather started it with honest work and genuine pride. My father had twisted it into something unrecognizable, cutting corners on safety regulations, bribing city officials for permits, and using offshore accounts to hide millions in unpaid taxes. I discovered it all by accident 2 years ago when I was tasked with organizing old financial records. What started as mundane filing became the most eye-opening experience of my life. My brother walked out of the office that day with his chest puffed out, already making plans for his first board meeting. He'd always been the golden child, the one who got the better grades, the better opportunities, the unconditional love that I'd spent my entire life trying to earn. But he was also naive, completely unaware of the criminal foundation his new empire was built on. I gave them exactly 3 weeks to enjoy their victory. Update 1. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning. I'd anonymously sent a comprehensive dossier to the IRS, complete with bank statements, forged inspection reports, and recorded conversations I'd been collecting for months. The federal agents showed up at 9 a.m. sharp, armed with search warrants and enough evidence to shut down operations immediately. I was in my small apartment across town when my phone started buzzing. My brother called first, his voice panicked and confused. He told me federal agents were everywhere, that they'd seized all the computers and financial records, that Dad was locked in emergency meetings with lawyers. He asked if I knew what was happening, and I told him I was as shocked as he was. My father called an hour later. His voice was different, smaller somehow. He asked me to come to the house immediately, that the family needed to stick together during this crisis. For the first time in my life, he actually sounded like he needed me. I drove to the family estate slowly, savoring every minute of the journey. The house looked the same from the outside, imposing, pristine, designed to intimidate. But I knew that inside, everything was crumbling. My mother answered the door with red-rimmed eyes. She'd been crying, something I'd rarely seen in my 28 years. She hugged me tighter than usual and whispered that she was scared. I told her everything would be okay, and for once, I meant it, at least for her. The living room felt like a war room. My father sat hunched over his laptop, frantically making phone calls to lawyers and accountants. My brother paced back and forth, still wearing his new CEO suit, but looking like a lost child. When I walked in, they both looked at me with desperate hope, as if I might have some magical solution to their problems. My father explained that the IRS had found discrepancies in their tax filings going back 7 years. Someone had provided them with detailed evidence of financial irregularities. He asked if I had any idea who might want to hurt the family business. I shook my head and suggested maybe it was a disgruntled employee or a competitor trying to sabotage us. Update 2. The second wave hit 3 days later. The city's building inspector arrived with a team to examine every construction project we'd completed in the past 5 years. I'd made sure they had copies of the original safety reports, the real ones, not the falsified versions my father had submitted to get permits approved. 2 of our buildings were immediately condemned. The inspector found structural deficiencies that could have killed hundreds of people. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly our family name was synonymous with corruption and negligence. My brother called me that evening, completely broken. He told me he'd had no idea about any of the safety violations, that he'd trusted Dad to handle everything properly. He was talking about stepping down as CEO, about trying to distance himself from the scandal. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered all the times he'd stood by silently while Dad berated me. All the family dinners where he'd been praised while I was ignored. All the opportunities that should have been mine that were handed to him without question. My sympathy evaporated quickly. The third blow came from an unexpected source. One of the city councilmen my father had been bribing for years got nervous and decided to cooperate with the FBI investigation. He provided recordings of their conversations, bank records showing the payments, and testimony about the entire corruption network my father had built. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, eating takeout Chinese food and feeling more satisfied than I'd felt in years. The reporter stood outside our company headquarters, explaining how a multi-generational family business had been built on a foundation of lies and criminal activity. They showed photos of my father being led away in handcuffs, his face hidden behind his hands. My mother called me that night, sobbing. She told me they'd frozen all the family accounts, that the lawyers were demanding payment up front, that she didn't know how they were going to survive. I drove over immediately and held her while she cried, promising that I'd take care of her no matter what happened. Update 3. The final piece of my revenge came 2 weeks later. The FBI had been investigating the money laundering operation I'd uncovered, tracing payments through shell companies and offshore accounts. They'd found enough evidence to file federal charges against my father for tax evasion, bribery, and conspiracy. My brother tried to save the company by cooperating with investigators, but it was too late. The damage to our reputation was irreversible. Clients canceled contracts, suppliers demanded immediate payment, and our stock price collapsed overnight. I sat in the courthouse during my father's arraignment, watching him plead not guilty to charges that carried a potential 20-year sentence. He looked older somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. When his eyes found mine in the gallery, I saw something I'd never seen before: fear. After the hearing, my brother approached me in the hallway. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He told me he'd been thinking about our conversation in Dad's office, about how I'd said this was justice because of his secrets. He asked me directly if I'd been the one to expose everything. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. I said that maybe if Dad had treated people better, if he'd built something honest instead of something corrupt, none of this would have happened. I reminded him that I'd tried for years to earn a place in this family, only to be told I should never have been born. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes. He asked me how long I'd known about the illegal activities, and I told him long enough to do something about it. Final update. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop reading about my father's sentencing. 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. The family business was completely dissolved, its assets seized to pay back taxes and penalties. My brother had moved across the country, taking a middle management job at a small construction firm. He'd called me once to say he understood why I'd done what I did, but that he couldn't forgive me for destroying our family. I told him our family had been destroyed long before I got involved. I'd just made it visible. My mother was living in a small apartment downtown, supported by the modest savings account I'd opened for her years ago. She never asked me directly about my role in everything that happened, but sometimes I caught her looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She'd lost her husband and her lifestyle, but she'd gained a son who actually cared about her well-being. The construction industry in our city was slowly recovering from the scandal. New regulations had been put in place, inspection processes had been overhauled, and several other companies had been investigated based on information that came out during my father's trial. I'd inadvertently helped clean up an entire corrupt system. I started my own small consulting firm, helping companies ensure their compliance with safety and financial regulations. It was honest work, something my grandfather would have been proud of. I used the skills I'd learned documenting my father's crimes to help other businesses avoid the same mistakes. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted what I'd done, if I missed having a family business to inherit. I always told them that some inheritances aren't worth keeping. My father had built his empire on lies and corruption, treating people as disposable and caring only about profit. He'd told me I should never have been born, but in the end, I was the only one strong enough to do what needed to be done. The last time I saw him was through bulletproof glass at the federal prison. He looked smaller in his prison uniform, his hair completely gray now. He asked me why I destroyed everything he'd worked for, and I reminded him of what he'd said in his office that day. I told him that maybe if he'd built something worth preserving, I would have tried to preserve it. He stared at me for a long time before asking if I felt like I'd won. I told him this was never about winning or losing. It was about justice. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for karma to catch up with those who hurt them. I just decided to give karma a helping hand. As I walked out of that prison for the last time, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete peace with my choices. My father had spent 40 years building an empire on corruption and cruelty. I'd spent 3 years tearing it down with nothing but truth and patience. He was right about one thing. Maybe I should never have been born into his world. But I was exactly who I needed to be to end it.